The first time Commander Vrix heard a human whisper, "I have an idea," he dismissed it as a meaningless quirk of a primitive species. By the fifth time, he had already updated the Aquarian Council's official threat assessment to include an entire subsection titled, "Humans, Immediate Containment Required Upon Idea Declaration." And that was before he met Elijah Rawlins. The diplomatic station floated in neutral orbit over the burnt orange surface of Utros V, a planet so barren it made Mars look like a tropical paradise. Commander Vrix stood near the observation panels, his four thin hands clasped behind his back, his pale, reptilian eyes fixed on the incoming shuttle. It was small, battered, and embarrassingly underarmed for a diplomatic transport. Inside it was Elijah, a former engineer from Detroit who had stumbled into interstellar diplomacy the same way a raccoon stumbles into a nuclear reactor, accidentally with a lot of noise and somehow surviving against all odds. The shuttle docked with a heavy clang. A moment later, the hatch creaked open and Elijah climbed out, lugging a duffel bag that looked like it had been through several wars. He wore a loose cargo jacket, jeans, and boots scuffed to the point of disrespect. Commander Vrix approached, accompanied by two guards. He extended a long, sinewy arm. "Elijah Rawlins, welcome to Station Vorton." Elijah shook his hand without hesitation. "Nice place. Looks like a DMV had a baby with a prison." Vrix blinked. "I do not understand this. Analogy, you will," Elijah said with a grin. Vrix led Elijah through the sterile corridors, explaining the situation. A minor diplomatic scuffle had turned ugly between the Drevik Consortium and the Lathari Dominion. Trade routes were threatened, tempers were flaring, and both sides demanded a neutral mediator. Humanity, being the newest addition to the Galactic Concord, was considered neutral, mostly because no one could figure out if humans were brilliant, insane, or both. As they entered the council chamber, Elijah caught sight of the assembled aliens. Hulking Dreviks with stone-like skin, wiry Lathari with gossamer wings, and several other species, each more irritated than the last. Vrix gestured toward the center podium. "This is where you will present your mediation proposal." Elijah scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, about that, I have an idea." Vrix froze, his pupils dilated. One of the guards audibly gasped. Elijah, oblivious, walked straight to the podium. The Lathari ambassador, a tall creature with shimmering blue feathers, hissed, "We will not negotiate under threat of human madness." Elijah raised his hands. "Relax, just hear me out." He pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his jacket and began sketching. Within minutes, he had outlined a rotating trade agreement, a shared taxation system, and a neutral third-party enforcement agency composed of species who hated both sides equally. It was absurd, convoluted, and violated at least 17 intergalactic protocols. It was also brilliant. After 3 grueling hours of debate, shouting, and one minor fistfight, which Elijah narrowly avoided by ducking behind a Lathari delegate, the agreement was signed. Vrix stared at Elijah afterward, a deep unease settling into his bones. "You whispered you had an idea," Vrix said quietly, "and within hours you reshaped centuries of trade law." Elijah shrugged. "It wasn't even my best idea." Vrix decided then he would never, ever allow Elijah to whisper those words again without immediate containment. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. 3 weeks later, Station Vorton received an emergency distress call from the mining colony on Grelix Roman 4. A seismic event had trapped over 200 colonists underground. The Aquarian rescue teams were en route, but the situation was deteriorating fast. As Vrix prepared the station's limited rescue resources, Elijah strolled into the command center, munching lazily on a protein bar. "What's up?" Elijah asked. Vrix explained the situation briskly, already feeling a knot form in his chest. Elijah's eyes lit up. "I have an idea." Vrix knocked over his chair, scrambling backward. "No," Vrix barked. "No ideas," Elijah frowned. You're seriously gonna say no to an idea when people's lives are on the line? Vrix hesitated. Elijah leaned closer. Trust me. Against every fiber of his training, Vrix allowed it. Within minutes, Elijah had assembled a plan involving retrofitting abandoned drilling equipment, using compressed gas charges to create controlled collapses, and a coordinated human-alien volunteer task force to dig escape tunnels. The equipment was ancient and barely functional. Several volunteers openly questioned Elijah's sanity. Still, within 12 harrowing hours, bruised and filthy, the task force broke through to the trapped colonists. Every single one was alive, though dehydrated and battered. Elijah sat on the ground afterward, panting heavily, a deep gash across his forearm where a support beam had caught him. A medic rushed over, but Elijah waved him off. Vrix knelt beside him. "You are injured." Elijah winced. "Yeah, feels like I got hit by a semi." "We must assess the wound properly," Vrix insisted. They brought Elijah to the medical bay, where a thorough scan revealed a torn muscle and several chipped bones in his wrist. Elijah gritted his teeth through the splinting and stitching, refusing painkillers, until the worst was over. The recovery would take weeks, and Vrix watched in amazement as Elijah endured physical therapy with a stubbornness that bordered on pathological. Most beings in the galaxy would have taken a year to recover. Elijah was walking gingerly within 6 weeks, lifting light objects at 8 and fully operational by 12. It wasn't superhuman. It was simply human, and it terrified Vrix more than he could admit. The final straw came during the diplomatic summit on Verdun Prime. Several high-ranking species gathered to discuss the formation of a joint defense fleet. Tensions were running high. Old grudges resurfaced. Weapons were drawn. Vrix, already sweating through his uniform, turned to Elijah, who was supposed to be the neutral observer. Elijah leaned close and whispered, "I have an idea." Vrix grabbed the nearest table for support. This time, Elijah's idea was simple, a contest. Each species would present their best unarmed fighter to compete in a series of skill-based challenges. The winner species would be given the honor of designing the fleet's command structure. At first, the ambassadors were insulted, then, grudgingly, intrigued. It was fair. It was honorable. It was insane. And it worked. The contests ranged from obstacle courses to problem-solving puzzles. There were injuries, a few heated arguments, and several near disqualifications, but in the end, the event fostered more goodwill than years of boring negotiations ever could. Elijah, sporting a black eye from where a Lothari athlete had accidentally clipped him during a demonstration, grinned through the swelling. Vrix stared at him, realizing the terrible truth. It wasn't that humans were invincible. It wasn't that they were smarter or stronger or faster. It was that no matter the odds, no matter the insanity of the situation, a human like Elijah could whisper, "I have an idea," and somehow, impossibly, make it work. That adaptability, that reckless courage, that refusal to accept that something was impossible, it made humans the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not because they sought conquest, because they sought solutions. And sometimes, the solutions were worse than the problems. Later, long after the Verdun summit concluded and Elijah was officially recognized as an unofficial special envoy, a title Vrix suspected was invented just to keep him from blowing up more treaties with his ideas. They sat together in the observation deck. The stars drifted lazily past the window. Elijah sipped from a battered thermos. "You know, Vrix, I might have another idea." Vrix bolted upright, knocking over his chair again. "No," Vrix barked. "No more ideas." Elijah laughed until he nearly choked. And for the first time in a long while, Vrix allowed himself a chuckle too. Because if there was one constant in the universe, it was this: even the bravest alien would shudder when a human whispered, "I have an idea." Station Vorton's hangar bay smelled like overheating metal and wet stone, and Elijah Rawlins was absolutely convinced the ceiling was about to fall in. "It's not supposed to sound like that, right?" Elijah asked, tilting his head toward the grinding noise from above. Commander Vrix, standing stiffly beside him, didn't glance up. The station is structurally stable, mostly. Elijah chuckled and shifted his duffel bag higher on his shoulder. Reassuring. They weren't alone. Dozens of alien delegates swarmed the arrival platform, each more colorful and ornery than the last. Today was the start of the Cultural Exchange Initiative, a program designed to promote unity through shared experience. In reality, it was an excuse for species to snoop on each other's habits without starting another trade war. Elijah pulled a crumpled pamphlet from his jacket pocket. Across the top, bold letters read, "Experience the best of every world," he snorted. They forgot to add, and probably regret it. Vrix adjusted the collar of his diplomatic sash. "You are scheduled for the culinary demonstration. I thought I was doing the mechanical symposium." That changed. After last week's incident with the plasma conduits, several species requested your reassignment. Elijah grinned. "People just can't appreciate a shortcut." Vrix's eyes narrowed. "They appreciate living facilities that do not detonate." As they moved toward the demonstration hall, Elijah noticed the floor panels vibrating underfoot. Somewhere deeper in the station, a siren gave a lazy, half-hearted wail before dying. "Definitely fine," Elijah muttered. Inside the hall, long tables were set up in a rough semicircle. At each, representatives from different species prepared traditional dishes. The air was thick with smells, some mouth-watering, others producing the kind of nausea usually reserved for deep space turbulence. At the far end, a squat, beetle-like creature was flambeing something that looked suspiciously like a boot. Closer to the center, a trio of crystalline beings stirred vats of fluorescent liquid. Elijah's table was an empty slab labeled "Human Cuisine." A young, nervous-looking assistant approached, carrying a crate of supplies. She had the translucent skin and delicate antennae of a Ilari, and her hands trembled as she set the crate down. "Good fortune, human Elijah," she said, bowing so low her forehead brushed the table. "Thanks. Hope you're not allergic to anything," Elijah said, rifling through the crate. His supplies were basic: flour, oil, salt, a few canned goods, and a battered portable stove. The Ilari assistant scurried away, casting one last, worried glance over her shoulder. Vrix remained nearby, arms folded, watching like a man observing a bomb he couldn't defuse. Elijah set to work. He decided to make fried bread, a simple dish that had gotten him through his lean college years. The ingredients were forgiving, the process quick, and if you burned it, you could just claim it was authentic. The stove sputtered to life with a wheeze. Elijah mixed flour and water by hand, forming rough discs and tossing them into the pan. The sizzle drew immediate attention. A Dravik lumbered over, sniffing the air suspiciously. Its nostrils flared, and it made a sound like rocks grinding together. "What is that?" it rumbled. "Fried dough," Elijah said, flipping one piece. "Simple, greasy, delicious." "Want to try?" The Dravik hesitated, then grabbed a piece between two massive fingers. It sniffed again, then shoved the entire thing into its mouth. A tense moment passed. Then the Dravik's eyes widened. It let out a delighted growl and thumped Elijah on the back so hard he nearly face-planted into the stove. Encouraged, other delegates drifted over. A Lethari fluttered down, its iridescent wings catching the overhead lights. A trio of squat, amphibious beings hopped closer, their wide mouths open in expectation. Elijah fried more bread, tossing it onto plates with increasing speed. He added a sprinkle of salt here, a dab of canned butter there. Soon a small crowd had formed, laughing, chattering, and most astonishingly waiting in an orderly line. Vrix observed in disbelief. "I do not understand," he said, almost to himself. "You create an inferior food product, yet they adore it." Elijah shrugged, flipping another disc. "It's not about fancy ingredients, it's about comfort. Something warm, simple, easy to share." A Grythian, whose species usually subsisted on nutrient vapor, tentatively nibbled a piece and immediately burst into a chorus of melodic chirps, a clear sign of approval. By the time the demonstration ended, Elijah's table was picked clean. Delegates left with crumbs in their hands and grease stains on their otherwise immaculate robes. Vrix approached, surveying the wreckage. "You have once again altered interspecies relations without authorization." "I prefer the term enhanced," Elijah said, wiping his hands on a cloth. Vrix's antennae twitched in frustration. "There will be consequences." "Probably," Elijah agreed cheerfully, "but hey, nobody's bleeding this time." "Progress?" Before Vrix could reply, an urgent message crackled through the station's intercom system. "Medical emergency. Sector 7. Request immediate assistance." Every head in the hall turned. Vrix stiffened. "Sector 7 houses the environmental regulators." "If the systems fail, we all suffocate," Elijah finished, already packing his gear. "Got it." Without waiting for permission, he bolted for the nearest exit. Vrix cursed in his native tongue and followed. They reached Sector 7 within minutes. The air was already thickening, the temperature rising dangerously. Technicians scrambled over consoles, shouting diagnostics that made less and less sense as panic took hold. At the center of the chaos, a Larry engineer lay sprawled on the floor, her chest rising in shallow, rapid jerks. Her skin had gone from translucent to a worrying shade of gray. Elijah dropped to his knees beside her. "She's crashing," he said grimly. Vrix hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to intervene or stay back. "She requires Ilari medical protocols," he said. "We must summon specialist support." "She'll be dead before they get here," Elijah snapped. He ripped open the Ilari's emergency medkit. Most of the supplies were alien to him, but he recognized a breathing mask and a vial labeled in 3 different languages, one of which was a rough galactic standard he could barely read. "Respiro gel," Elijah muttered. "Oxygen equivalent." He jammed the mask over the Ilari's face and injected the gel into the intake valve. Her chest hitched, then settled into a steadier rhythm. Meanwhile, the environmental regulators continued to malfunction. Sparks flew from an overhead conduit, showering the floor with angry blue light. Vrix pointed toward the main control panel. "If the primary coolant systems are not restored within 10 minutes, the regulators will initiate shutdown procedures." "Guess I'm fixing it," Elijah said, tearing off his jacket. The panel was a nightmare of mismatched wiring and jury-rigged components. Whoever had designed it clearly hadn't expected a human to come poking around. Elijah yanked open a maintenance hatch and crawled inside. The heat was brutal. Sweat poured from his scalp, blurring his vision. His injured wrist, still weak from the recent therapy, throbbed painfully as he twisted wires and rerouted circuits. 5 minutes, Vrix called. Elijah grunted in acknowledgement. He found the coolant bypass valve, jammed shut with a crystallized mass of something he didn't want to identify. He braced his foot against the panel wall, gritted his teeth, and heaved. Something popped. Fluid gushed through the reopened pipe, hissing as it cooled the surrounding machinery. The temperature in the room dropped almost immediately. Elijah crawled out, coughing, face red and streaked with grime. The technicians burst into cheers. The Ilari engineer, still weak but conscious now, reached out a trembling hand. Elijah squeezed it gently. Vrix approached, looking more rattled than Elijah had ever seen him. "You endangered yourself without hesitation," Vrix said. "Again." "Wasn't really thinking about it," Elijah admitted. "Just needed to get it done." Vrix studied him for a long moment. "It is difficult for us to comprehend," he said finally. "You humans act before calculation. You survive when survival should be impossible. You adapt in ways other species cannot predict." Elijah gave a tired grin. "We call it winging it." Vrix shook his head slowly. "It is why even the bravest among us fear when a human whispers, 'I have an idea.'" Elijah stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and glanced around at the recovering systems, the grateful faces, the clear air. "Good thing I didn't say it this time," he said, and then he collapsed. Vrix caught him before he hit the ground, shouting for the medics. Hours later in the infirmary, Elijah woke with a splitting headache and an angry nurse jabbing a rehydration Roman 4 into his arm. "You suffered severe heat exhaustion," Vrix informed him from a nearby chair. "You tore the muscles in your wrist again, and you have second-degree burns along your forearms," Elijah groaned. "So, not my best day." "The colony owes you their lives," Vrix said. "That and a donut would make it worth it," Elijah muttered. Vrix stood. "Rest now, human Elijah." "And when you next have an idea?" Elijah cracked one eye open. "Yeah," Vrix's mouth twitched almost a smile. "Warn me first." The infirmary lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the room. Elijah lay propped up by several stiff pillows, an ugly bandage wrapped around his forearms and a dull ache radiating from his ribs. His jacket and boots were gone. He'd been left in a thin station-issued tunic that did nothing to fight the chill. Vrix stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed tightly. A datapad floated beside him, projecting a steady stream of medical metrics. Elijah shifted slightly, wincing as his wrist twinged. "Thought you said this place was structurally stable," Elijah said, voice raspy. Vrix didn't blink. "Structural stability does not account for biological recklessness." A low chuckle escaped Elijah's throat before he grimaced. "Recklessness gets a bad rap. You tore ligaments, suffered thermal burns, mild dehydration, and oxygen deprivation within a single cycle." "Yeah, but—" "Success, right?" Elijah managed a lopsided grin. Vrix tapped the datapad sharply, silencing it. "Success is not measured by the number of injuries accumulated." A soft chime sounded from the doorway. An Avathi medic glided in, her translucent wings folding neatly against her back. She carried a fresh Roman 4 bag and a tray with several neatly organized syringes. Without speaking, she replaced Elijah's saline drip and injected a mild pain reliever into the line. He sighed as the pressure in his arms eased. "She says you're lucky," Vrix translated after a moment. Elijah squinted up at the medic. "You're not wrong, sweetheart." The Avathi tilted her head, confused by the term of endearment, but said nothing. Once she left, Vrix stepped closer. His mouth twitched in thought. "You will be confined to quarters for recovery," Vrix said. "Mandatory rest." Elijah shifted again, trying to find a position that didn't make him feel like a broken marionette. "Sounds boring. Boring prevents funerals." Elijah let his eyes drift toward the ceiling tiles. "You ever think maybe we're built different?" he said. "Humans, I mean. Maybe we're like cockroaches. You stomp us, gas us, drown us, we just find a way to crawl back." Vrix considered that. A disturbing but accurate analogy. The door opened again, admitting an elder Lathari delegate, her wings dulled with age. She approached the bed with a slow, deliberate gait, clutching a small metal case. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Friend of yours," she requested an audience, Vrix said. The Lathari placed the case on the bedside table and clicked it open to reveal a delicate silver pendant shaped like a spiral. "For preserving life without expectation of reward," she said, her accent thick but clear. "It is custom among our kind to honor such acts." Elijah hesitated, then accepted the pendant with his good hand. It was heavier than it looked. "Thanks," he said, genuinely touched. The Lathari bowed once, wings fluttering softly, and departed without another word. Vrix watched her leave, then turned back to Elijah. "You have achieved more goodwill through recklessness than the Concorde managed through decades of diplomacy." "Maybe they should get hurt more often," Elijah muttered. "You will not joke about this," Vrix said sharply. His tone softened slightly. "You nearly died." Elijah looked down at the pendant, feeling its cool weight against his palm. "Yeah, guess that's starting to sink in." Vrix tapped a few commands into the datapad, then set it aside. "You require physical therapy, strengthening exercises, nutritional adjustments. Your wrist will remain vulnerable for at least 4 cycles." Elijah groaned. You're worse than my old coach. I take that as a compliment, Vrix said dryly. There was a long pause. Outside the infirmary window, the station's external lights blinked against the endless dark. After a while, Elijah spoke again. You ever wonder why we do it? He asked. Why we keep pushing even when it's stupid? Vrix tilted his head. Explain. Elijah shifted so he could look at him properly. It's not just survival, it's stubbornness, hope, maybe both. We're not wired to quit. Even when everything says we should. Vrix was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. Finally, he said, it is a dangerous strength. Maybe, Elijah agreed, but it's what got us off our rock in the first place. Vrix studied him, something unreadable in his gaze. You are a paradox, Vrix said. Fragile but relentless, foolish yet ingenious, a species that thrives on chaos, Elijah chuckled weakly. We do love a good mess. Another soft chime indicated a shift change. Outside the room, the murmur of station personnel grew louder. Vrix straightened. You will remain here until cleared by medical personnel. No exceptions. Elijah gave a lazy salute. Yes, sir. Vrix hesitated, then added, and no ideas. Elijah's grin widened. No promises. Vrix turned to leave but paused at the door. Rest well, human Elijah, he said. Elijah leaned back against the pillows, feeling the ache in every bone, the heaviness of exhaustion pressing down. For once, he didn't argue. 3 days later, Elijah was discharged under strict orders to limit his activity. His wrist was braced, his burns were healing, and he had a list of exercises longer than most peace treaties. He shuffled into the station's communal garden, a domed space filled with hardy plants adapted to zero-gravity environments. It smelled faintly of wet earth, and something spicy he couldn't identify. He found an empty bench under a flowering vine and sat down heavily. The garden wasn't empty for long. A group of young Ilari engineers arrived, chattering animatedly. They carried small mechanical devices, prototypes of some kind, clearly excited to test them. Elijah watched as they set up their equipment. One of the devices, a squat, boxy thing with blinking lights, began to shudder violently the moment it activated. Sparks flew. The Ilari panicked, trying to shut it down. Without thinking, Elijah pushed himself up and limped over. Pull the power core, he shouted. The engineers hesitated. Now, one of them yanked a panel open and disconnected a glowing crystal. The device powered down with a dying whine. The Ilari turned to Elijah, wide-eyed. He waved them off. Just needed a fresh set of eyes. The youngest engineer, barely waist-high, peered up at him. You are the human who saved the colony, he said. Yeah, Elijah said, scratching the back of his neck. That's me. The young Ilari beamed. Will you teach us? Elijah blinked. Teach you what? How to fix things. The human way. He laughed, then winced as his ribs protested. All right, Elijah said, lowering himself to the ground. Lesson 1. When something you built tries to kill you, don't panic. Panic makes you stupid. The Ilari listened intently, their antennae twitching with focus. He showed them how to identify faulty wiring, how to jury-rig a power bypass, how to recognize when a machine was lying to you through its diagnostics. Hours passed without him noticing. When he finally stood to leave, sore but satisfied, Vrix was waiting at the edge of the garden, arms folded. You were supposed to be resting, Vrix said. Teaching is restful, Elijah said innocently. Vrix glanced at the gathered Ilari, some still tinkering with their devices under Elijah's watchful eye. Perhaps your recklessness is contagious. Elijah grinned. Wouldn't be the worst thing. They walked back toward the main concourse together, the garden fading behind them. For once, there were no alarms, no emergencies, no whispered ideas ready to detonate into chaos. Just a battered human and a cautious alien companion, sharing a quiet moment of fragile peace. And somewhere deep in the station, a small group of young engineers were learning that sometimes, survival wasn't about perfection. It was about adaptability. And maybe, just maybe, about having one good idea at exactly the wrong time.